Brought to you by Charity Mobile. Support life with every call and text when you switch your cell phone service. Use promo code TRADITION at CharityMobile.com for a special Christmas offer now through February 2nd. Today, the 7th of January, Pope Leo XIV is meeting with the College of Cardinals at an extraordinary synod. Before we get to that, though, that's important news, I received this in the mail from Seraphim Company Incorporated. They did not pay me to show you this, but they did ask that I make it clear that if a seminarian or a priest who is dedicated to tradition or interested in the traditional Mass and the traditional sacraments would like a free calendar, they can go and get one by contacting them through here. I'll show you their website, the Seraphim Company. To get one, you just have to go to their website and contact us. For the rest of you, if you'd like to buy one of their calendars, you can do it through their website. Second year they've sent me one of these, and I'll just show you a little bit here. Month of June, big month in the secular world, and this calendar's got the priorities straight. So it has all the feast days and all the rest of the stuff, your fasting schedule, according to the pre-conciliar traditional Mass calendar. So that's available there. So for those of you interested, if you're a priest or a seminarian, contact them through their website and they can get you one. If you want to purchase one, go to their website, seraphimcompanyinc.com. Now, today is an important day because one of the big beefs in the church that the Cardinals had with Pope Francis, even his biggest allies had with him, was that he never met with the Cardinals unless he was making new cardinals because he had to at that point. Beyond that, he didn't meet with them as a body. That's a big deal because today is the day that Pope Leo is meeting with the College of Cardinals as a body. And wouldn't you know it, his meeting with them is going to be very, very synodal in nature. And this has raised some questions for some people because there are a lot of cardinals, relatively speaking, and this is a time for their voices to be heard, but the format doesn't really allow for that. So we're going to get into this. But if you're new here, hit like and subscribe. It would be greatly helpful. Or just hit like if you watch regularly. It does help a lot. Subscribe if you haven't. Helps this channel grow, especially in these times where our wonderful hosts have their thumbs on the scales, as it were. But here we go to Diane Montagne's Substack. The story kind of developed yesterday. Under the headline, Program Details Emerge for Pope Leo XIV's First Consistory with Cardinals, Working Groups, and Lunch with the Pope, the program for the consistory. Now, Diane Montagne is a Vatican-accredited journalist who is in the press pool at the Vatican. She has asked some hard questions in the past at these press pool meetings, most famously during the Synod on Synodality, asking them the kinds of questions that many of us would have liked to have asked ourselves, except done in a more professional, journalistic way. And it ended up causing, controversies with the responses they gave. And one of those responses included the famous phrase, the new synodal church. So here we go for the details. Quote, program details for Pope Leo XIV's first extraordinary consistory with cardinals have emerged, revealing how the new pontificate plans to structure its first formal exchange with the Sacred College. In a January 6th report for Il Giornale, the Italian journalist Nico Spuntoni, who first disclosed the Pope's 4-point agenda for the meeting, notes that the 7th and 8th of January consistory will follow a carefully organized 2-day schedule, representing one of the earliest tests of Leo XIV's governing approach. The plan departs from traditional consistory formats, relying heavily on small working groups rather than extended plenary sessions. In other words, working groups are where most of the voices are going to have a chance to speak instead of just on the general floor. This method, previously used at the meeting of cardinals on the reform of the Roman Curia in late summer 2022, is intended to guide discussions on key themes, though some cardinals may question whether it allows sufficient opportunity for open collective debate. End quote. Now, that's an important point here, because it does look like this is going to be a guided discussion through the working group format. So we go here to Gloria TV, which kind of hammers this home. Under their headline, Program for Leo XIV's Consistory, Working Groups Like the Synod. breaks down like this. Day 1, opening and first session. Registration, that's when the Cardinals are checking in, will begin at noon local time. That's about an hour from the time I'm broadcasting this initially, on the 7th of January in the atrium of the satanic-looking Paul VI Hall. After a welcome coffee, proceedings will not begin until 3:30 p.m. Rome time in the new Synod Hall with communal prayer, followed by greetings from the Dean of the College of Cardinals, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re. Leo XIV will then deliver an introductory address and outline the work to be undertaken. There are 3 sessions over 2 days. The consistory is structured in 3 sessions and will rely on small working groups, which will later present group reports. The criteria for forming the working groups will be communicated after the Pope's introductory address. The use of working groups was not mentioned in the initial convocation sent on the 7th of November by the Cardinal Dean. The first session will conclude at 6:45 p.m. Rome time on the 7th of January with an address by the Pope in prayer. And then there will be a Mass the next morning, and then session 2 and 3 will happen on the 8th. And this is the key. The program allows limited time for a large number of participants, raising the question, posed and reporting on the schedule, of whether it will be possible for Leo XIV to hear the views of all those present. And the question I'm going to ask you here is, was this scripted this way? I tend to be more of a conspiratorial type when it comes to this stuff, because who's leading the working groups? Who gets to make that decision? Who leads the working groups will give you an idea of how opinions are filtered. Now, if this is done in an equitable manner, it's worth noting, of course, any retired Cardinals probably not participating in this. I could be wrong about that, though, and we'll see tomorrow or the next day if that's the case. But if these are all through and through synodalist, Bergoglian type Cardinals who are chairing all the working groups, then you're going to have a very filtered discussion. But the actual official program itself leaked to the internet and was published by the College of Cardinals report on Substack. These are the same people who did the dossier on every single cardinal in the College of Cardinals for the conclave that elected Pope Leo XIV. It was the one that told everybody that Cardinal Prevost was actually very, very much a progressive type of cardinal and would be a continuity with Pope Francis type, something people are now just wholesale ignoring. But here they published this, and I'll have a link to this in my own Substack a little while after this broadcast is done this morning. But here is the actual uploaded screenshots of it. So again, 1230 to 1500 hours, arrival and distribution of badges and documentation. This is all the stuff about arriving. There'll be welcome coffee at 1400 hours, Paul VI Hall. At 1330 or 1530 hours will be the opening prayer, the greeting by Cardinal Ray, the introductory address by the Pope, and then the first working group session, 1615 hours to 1900 hours. Of this, at 1615 or 4:15 for the Americans who are not used to what we call military time, will be the group work. This is where the groups will have their chance to discuss things. That will conclude at 1800 hours, where the reports from the groups will be given, meaning that will probably be finished at about 1750 hours or so. And then it'll be the address by the Holy Father and concluding prayer. You've got a lot of cardinals here in working groups. Is this sufficient time for them to air their questions and ask hard questions? Then on the 8th, Thursday, tomorrow at 0730 hours, Holy Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. And then it will be at 0930, the second session begins with prayer and introduction. And then at 15 minutes later, group work again starts with a break at 1100 hours. And then they meet up again at 1130, reports from groups and open interventions on the theme Angelus. And 1300 hours, lunch with the Pope. And then the third session, again, group work at 1530 hours, break at 1700 hours, and then the reports at 1730. We're having is 90 minutes each day, give or take, for these working groups to air the question of the day. And the Pope told them to, one of the things was, they're going to talk about the liturgy. A lot of people are pinning their hopes on this. But the real question here is, this is being asked by a lot of Catholics who went over this. And do we have, is there enough time being given to them to actually have a meaningful discussion? And so we go here to Mesa and Latina, one of the better European independent news outlets for the Catholic Church, saying under the headline, "News: The consistory of Cardinals today and tomorrow. Only 100 minutes of free speech." Now, it's 100 minutes per session, per working group session. Only one today and two of them tomorrow. So 300 minutes. It's about 5 hours. Is that enough time? I don't think it is, personally. Especially, it depends on who is running each of the working groups. Spuntoni wrote, "The free interventions, which were the central part of the old consistories, are reduced to less than 60 minutes in the second session, 45 minutes in the third section of the second and final day. It will be held in the infamous tables and small working groups of Bergoglian and synodal memory." And the synodal working groups under Francis were very controlled. Very controlled. And so you're going to see that here today. Now, it could be that good things come from this. It could very well be, because there is an itch to talk about things like the liturgy. And some bishops who are not invited are raised their voice using their very large platforms that they have. And I'm going to show you something that might be the very best thing I've seen Bishop Robert Barron post in a very long time. And I say that because I'm not a big fan of Bishop Barron. He's a big fan of a lot of theologians that are very problematic, and he's a staunch defender of the post-conciliar order and not exactly a quote-unquote friend to tradition. But this is probably one of the best things he's said in a while. I have no personal animus against the bishop, though. He said the following on X: "I understand that one of the topics under consideration at the consistory of Cardinals is synodality. I'm speaking as a bishop who was an elected delegate to both rounds of the synod and synodality in Rome, and who has just presided over a local synod in my own diocese. Synods are good and useful tools for the determination of practical pastoral strategies, but they ought not to be forums for debate regarding doctrine. When settled teaching becomes a subject for synodal determination, the church devolves into relativism and self-doubt, as is clearly evident in the misconceived synodal way in Germany. I'm sympathetic with the founders of the journal Communio, Joseph Ratzinger, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Henry de Lubac. For those not aware, there was the Concilium and Communio. These were the two factions after the Vatican II revolution. Every revolution after the revolution breaks into essentially a more liberal and a more conservative faction. That's how you can kind of think of them in overly simplified terms. And Communio was Joseph Ratzinger's faction, the more conservative one. The one that many of you will, if you had to live under the post-conciliar order, which we do technically, then you would choose the Communio faction, because these are the group who are trying to reconcile the new order of things after Vatican II with pre-conciliar Catholicism, as opposed to celebrating a total break from things, as Concilium did, oversimplifying things. But they broke with the journal Concilium, the stated purpose of which was the perpetuation of the spirit of Vatican II. That's what Concilium, the other faction, wanted. The great Communio theologians said that councils are indeed sometimes necessary in the life of the church, but that one sighs with relief at the end of a council, for the church can then return to its essential work. As long as it sits in council, the church is in suspense, unsure of itself, wringing its hands. It was precisely the perpetuation of the spirit of Vatican II that led to so much vacillation and drift in the years when I was coming of age. So if we must continue with synodality, let it be dedicated to the consideration of practical means by which the church can more effectively do its work of worshiping God, evangelizing, and serving the poor. And let it not be a defining and permanent feature of the church's life, lest we lose our verve and focus." In other words, he's very much worried that this period of uncertainty that always comes with councils is going to become the new normal in the church, a period of wringing of hands and a period of uncertainty. That's his message to the Cardinals, and it's a good one. Now, I wish it was a little more forceful, to just upend and get rid of synodality at all, other than as maybe a guiding principle for how a bishop should meet with laity in his diocese, maybe. But it's very clear that synodality is being used as the way to keep the permanent revolution going in the church. Revolution without end. That is their goal. Now, there's another topic going to be discussed. Trust me, we'll return to the church in Germany here in a few minutes. But another topic, and that's the one of the liturgy. And so we go here to an article that was making the rounds yesterday, the text of which was posted by Dr. Peter Kwasniewski to his personal Facebook and I presume his X account. It's posted originally to the CatholicHerald.com and it's written by Dom Alcuin Reed. I use up most of my free Catholic Herald articles that I can, so we're going to go with what Dr. Kwasniewski posted here. And the headline for the article is, "The Cardinals Consistory, Will the Church Heal Her Liturgical Wounds?" And Father Reed begins with going over, the basic history of this call to the conclave. But then he goes this. In his letter to the Cardinals before Christmas, Pope Leo indicated that this consistory would include an in-depth theological, historical, and pastoral reflection in order to retain sound tradition and yet remain open to legitimate progress. That is encouraging on two fronts, says the priest. I actually don't think this is encouraging, but the priest does. He is coming from a much more moderate position than I take on discussion of the liturgy. I have real questions about what sound tradition means, because in the capital T tradition of the church, all of the traditions are sound. So if you want to retain sound tradition, you're retaining all of them. And what does legitimate progress mean in the liturgy here? Now, Father Reed continues saying, first, because it indicates that the Holy Father recognizes that there is an issue here that needs to be addressed. The more than unfortunate attempt to settle liturgical questions aimed at by the sheer product of prelatical political maneuvering, that is the motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, in its disastrous pastoral impact, cry out to heaven for redress. Pope Benedict XVI was right when he taught that what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the Church's faith and prayer and give them their proper place. As we now know, when consulted over a decade later, the majority of the world's bishops, whether they personally appreciated the older rites or not, did not have a problem with this principle or with its practical implementation. On the contrary, they praised its fruits. What he's referring to there was when Traditionis Custodes was issued, the Cardinal Roche and Pope Francis told everybody that the bishops of the church had been surveyed about the traditional mass, and they said it was a cause of division and it was causing too many problems and yada, 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 which turned out to be just a bald-faced lie. Because eventually those surveys were actually released, and it turned out that most of the bishops didn't have a problem with Summorum Pontificum, that most of the traditional Catholics in their diocese just went to Mass and lived their lives as Catholics. Surprise, surprise. Secondly, the Holy Father's use of the phrase, in order to retain sound tradition and yet remain open to legitimate progress, which is from Article 23 of the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, indicates a certain nuance. Indeed, for those who have studied the Council's Constitution, this article is a critical key to understanding its intention to initiate a moderate, not a radical or root and branch reform of the liturgy, in clear continuity with the tradition it had received. Now, he is giving you, again, a very Ratzinger-esque, Pope Benedict XVI style interpretation of the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium. Another reading of it says that it does open the door through its ambiguity to a radical root and branch reform of the liturgy, or more likely, better word is destruction of the liturgy. But he goes here at Article 23. He quotes Article 23 saying, quote, "There must be no innovations unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly requires them." And that is the phrase in Article 23, by the way, that the modernists used to annihilate the old Mass and to replace it with something made in a committee. You may not like me saying that, but it was literally made in a committee. Some of the prayers for consecration written on napkins in a cafe. And care must be taken that any new forms adopted should in some way grow organically from forms already existing. They clearly didn't pay that much attention to that, though. Whether the Holy Father intends to reopen the Pandora's box of the question of reforming the unorganic reform that was imposed following the council, so as to return to the council's own vision of continuity and not rupture, is not clear. but his language could certainly be taken to mean that the issues involved may be discussed. End quote. Now, he's sort of zeroing in on here that the language Leo used himself was ambiguous about what the aim for the liturgical discussions will be at this consistory. Now, you might be aware that with all of this talk of the liturgy, an article suddenly published a day or two ago as a sort of offering a sort of solution to the Traditionis Custodes Summorum Pontificum traditional Latin Mass question. It was something I was not a fan of. If you want to deeper dive into it, Dr. Taylor Marshall did a live stream yesterday or the day before. And I will just, like I said, I am not a fan. However, it goes like this. The proposal is written by a priest who is the head of one of the priestly fraternities, who suggested that all the traditional priestly fraternities be given essentially ordinariate status. Not ordinary, but kind of like the way Opus Dei was treated. And what that would do would be to solidify that they're allowed to exist. However, it would also put more control on this in the hands of the bishops, thus allowing traditional Catholics and the traditional Mass to be either banned entirely from dioceses or at least sent off to the sides, to the hinterlands. It's not something I'm a fan of. I want, at the very least, Summorum Pontificum restored and things actually allowed to flourish organically. That laity who wanted the traditional sacraments, the pre-conciliar form of the sacraments, have access to them if they want them. The way Summorum Pontificum said, even though bishops didn't enforce it. The WM Review posted a review of this idea under the headline, A Side Chapel in the Conciliar Synodal Church. Father De Blinieres, I think is how I am mispronouncing his name, and I have my apologies. Proposal. Traditionalists are to be what Bishop Fillet, the highest profile bishop of the SSPX, once called dinosaurs in a zoo. And that is exactly what would happen. It would become, the traditional Mass would be reduced to a curiosity in your diocese if this proposal were to be followed. At least that's my take on this, and that's clearly what his take is here. Diamontania notes that the idea of a jurisdictional structure for the traditional rite has circulated for years. As early as 1963, the English author Evelyn Waugh suggested this in a letter to the tablet. Note the year, 1963, during the council. You remember, I just said, quoting Father Alcuin Reed, that the idea was that Summorum or Sacrosanctum Concilium, Vatican II's document on the liturgy, did not call for radical reform of the liturgy. That is actually a hotly contested claim. And in 1963, people thought otherwise, because otherwise Evelyn Waugh would not have said this in the tablet. Quote, Sir, the Eastern Uniate churches, meaning the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church, retain ancient habits of worship which are dear to them, and liturgies which in many cases are unintelligible to the faithful. Is this not the time to seek similar privileges for Roman Catholics? Will you promote an appeal to the Holy See for the establishment of a Uniate Latin Church, which shall observe all the rites as they existed in the reign of Pius IX? Your obedient servant, Evelyn Waugh. Chris Ferrara and Thomas Woods also raised the possibility in the Great Facade. Quote, the success of Cluny also demonstrates the potential of the canonical structure referred to today as an apostolic administration. By allowing the Cluniac houses to bypass the authority of the bishops, who in their days and hours were so often opponents of true reform, the Church gave this divinely inspired movement the room it needed to carry out its mission. Even though our situation is arguably worse than what Cluny faced, the immunity from the bishops that Cluny enjoyed would give us the ability to rebuild at least one segment of the Church. That is what Cluny did, and the rest of the Church ultimately followed. Now, you just heard me say that it would give the bishops more authority, and they're saying it wouldn't. If you're familiar with Opus Dei, I'm not a fan of Opus Dei. I'm not, but a lot of the bishops, they found ways to control Opus Dei to the point where recently Pope Leo essentially destroyed them, radically transformed them to the point where Opus Dei technically exists, but it is not Opus Dei anymore by any stretch. Even now, the author of this piece actually points out that Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre advocated such a structure at various times, calling it the experiment of tradition. at times as early as 1973 and as late as 1987. Lefebvre was calling for an arrangement under this title, which would permit a degree of autonomy from diocesan bishops while having his operations subject to a commission in Rome. However, as we shall see, Lefebvre firmly rejected any such possibility by 1988. Since the 1960s, the various mainstream Latin Mass Catholics and Ecclesia Dei groups have all tried to negotiate coexistence and toleration with the conciliar reformers so as to carve out a niche for themselves in the broad tent. These groups have tried to secure the existence of the Roman liturgy alongside the Novus Ordo liturgy. Some have sought a simple coexistence based on their preference for the old rite. Others have held that the Novus Ordo is harmful to souls and should. They have tried, and even succeeded to some degree, to secure an oasis wherein the true faith could be taught and professed in its integrity, whilst coexisting with those who openly deny or obscure it. Without realizing what is happening, these groups have accepted as a strategy the same situation which Cardinal Newman and many others lamented, whilst still in the Anglican Communion. Many of Catholic views are truly but a party in our church, said Cardinal Newman before he became Catholic. And that is exactly what would happen under this scenario. We would just become one faction among others. This would help further the Catholic Church's transformation into the Anglican Communion with valid sacraments. As the Archconciliar Synodalist Cardinal Roche correctly said in his 2021 comments about Traditionis Custodes, this way of thinking and operating is an ecclesiology that is not part of the Church's magisterium. This is essentially, I recommend a deeper dive if you want to go read on this, but this is actually, I think, a very dangerous proposition, but I don't think it's one that will see the light of day. There's a super chat, so we will go to it before we go to the the next part of things here. Shahana with the super chat, I appreciate it. If the TLM becomes ordinariate, we will never get restoration. And that is exactly correct. Restoration can happen organically. Here's how you do it. A very simple roadmap to the restoration of the TLM is the normative rite in the Catholic Church. It can happen in a very simple way. By Summorum Pontificum being fully restored and the Vatican actually enforcing the provisions in Summorum Pontificum that said any parish that wants it can have it, as long as there's enough parishioners in their parish who want it. The priest can then say it. The bishop can't tell him no. That was where the bishops quietly resisted Summorum Pontificum in some places. That's how it will happen. Because we know what the attrition numbers are in the Novus Ordo. People don't like hearing this, but it's like 80% of your children raised in the Novus Ordo, in the new Mass, leave the faith. They may come back at some time later, but they leave once they get confirmed. They stop attending Mass, or they become Creasters. They go to Mass on Christmas, Easter, maybe Ash Wednesday. Not a popular thing to say, but it's the truth. We have the data. Whereas in the traditional Mass, there's a retention rate. 75% of children raised in the traditional Mass stay Catholic. So the attrition rate there is 25%. That is not a great number either, by any stretch, but it's a much better number. And that is how the roadmap back, because we just know what the numbers are. Time will give us a restoration of the traditional Mass if things are allowed to just continue the way they are. But I don't think they're going to continue the way they are. Rome is moving quietly to implement Traditionis Custodes. Pope Leo has said he's not going to undo Traditionis Custodes. He might give exemptions and exceptions, excuse me, but those exemptions and exceptions are going to be given to the bishops who ask for them. The problem is most of the very conservative bishops, the ones most friendly to tradition, the ones who saw value, maybe liked the traditional Mass, they stopped resisting mostly years ago. There's only a few holdouts left. That's why you're not going to see too many bishops asking for exemptions. That's why I haven't reported on any yet, because I haven't seen one. Now, a point that should be discussed at this consistory, doubtful that it will, Bishop Robert Barron a minute ago alluded to it, and that's the church in Germany. We have unpleasant news out of the church in Germany, because it's always unpleasant. One of those touches directly on the governance of the universal church itself out of Rome. The woman who is in charge of the religious life in the Roman Curia, the first nun to be given a prefect position, they call her prefectress, she's a heretic, blatant open heretic. Francis appointed her, Leo reconfirmed her. And she has declared God as a woman. And she said this as part of a more complicated theological statement, but it's still nonsense. So here, we'll just jump right here, without any preamble, to Hereth in Exile, Mr. Chris Jackson's Substack. God is a woman. Leo's nun in charge of clergy. Modernism gets promoted as the path. Germany locks the tabernacles and lists the properties, and etc., etc. This is just sort of a news rundown piece from him. But the person he's talking about is Sister Brambilla. You may be familiar with her because I have covered her in the past. She was a real piece of work, as they say. God is a woman as Roman policy. Brambilla's feminist theology enthroned. If the church the church leaders, the highest ranking members of the church, want to really examine questions to solve problems in the church, it should be this question here, including why is someone who is not a cardinal in charge of the religious? On paper, you may think, well, that's fine to let a religious be in charge of the religious. There are cardinals who were monks. There are. And if there is, for some reason, one who's not right at the moment, there is absolutely a bishop somewhere who was a Dominican or a Franciscan or something that the Pope could elevate to being a cardinal and give him this job in the Roman Curia. And then you wouldn't have to necessarily worry about the women's ideology being turned into theology and official policy of the Vatican. Info Vaticana hands you a dossier that reads like parody. Then you remember it sits inside the Vatican's governing machinery. Sister Simona Brambilla is the prefect of the dicastery that oversees religious institutes worldwide, a jurisdictional office touching the lives of men and women religious, including priests bound to those institutes. The scandal begins with theological content. Info Vaticana reports Brambilla praising a matriarchal tribal worldview as anthropology and theology, then drawing from it a doctrinal-sounding conclusion. God is a mother. God is a woman, with woman described as the image most like God. That is feminist theology with a tribal wrapper, and it collides head-on with Christianity's revealed grammar. Christianity did not improvise God. It receives God. The Son reveals the Father. The Church receives the name, receives the prayer, receives the Trinity's self-disclosure, receives the liturgical address. Abba sits at the center of the Son's prayer, then becomes the Church's daily bread in the name Our Father. The entire feminist project here is an attempt to swap the given name for a constructed image, to move from revelation to anthropology, to treat culture as a source of divinity language rather than a field to be converted. This is your relativism. That always emerges when you see secular ideology trying to be elevated to theology, where you're putting theology at the service of ideology, as opposed to ideology being filtered through the theology of the church and being perfected. That is why God as a woman matters more than 1,000 sentimental homilies about closeness. It signals a theology that remakes God in the image of a program. Info Vaticana even frames it explicitly as feminist theology, as theology of women, linked to liberation categories, then carried into governance and mission. Then the second layer hits. This is not a classroom dispute. This theology sits in an office. Francis elevated her on the Feast of the Epiphany in 2025. The secular press applauded the move as female empowerment, and the Vatican soaked up the praise. The appointment included an unprecedented pro-prefect arrangement, Cardinal Angel Fernandez Time shadowing the structure with an opacity that looks designed to mute objections while keeping the headline. In other words, to make things, to calm down the nerves of the lay faithful and the cardinals in the Roman Curia, a cardinal was appointed to essentially sign off on things that she did. But she was the one in charge in an unprecedented move. Now Leo XIV owns it. He renewed Brambilla in an office after his election. There's the picture of them together. And Brambilla publicly thanked him for confirming her appointment and trusting the mission to her through him. Vatican News then reported Leo's appointment of Sister Tiziana Merletti, someone who's even worse, as secretary of the same dicastery under Brambilla, tightening the arrangement into a settled pattern. This is the part everyone keeps trying to dodge with managerial language. A woman has been placed over a dicastery whose work includes governing priests and religious institutes. Catholic tradition treats governance of clerics as an act of the sacred hierarchy, rooted in holy orders, not a corporate role that can be demasculinized like a boardroom. A modern Vatican can play word games about functional, collaboration, pro prefect, temporary, then the reality remains. Rome has installed a symbolic reversal and is calling it reform. A church that still believed in what it teaches would see two emergency flares here. One flare says doctrinal corruption. Feminist theology that replaces father with mother language is not development, not enrichment, not enculturation, not a poetic flourish. It's a direct attempt to rewrite the revealed address of God, then smuggle that rewrite into Catholic institutions through slogans about the marginalized, the feminine, the maternal, the new paradigm. The other says ecclesiological inversion. That would be the inversion of the hierarchy of the church. The priesthood and the hierarchy are not decorative, they're constitutive. The moment Rome treats authority over clergy as a staffing choice driven by optics, the sacramental order becomes negotiable furniture. And it goes on to talk about Leo the 14th's consistory. Be a good topic to have for that. Daria with her using her channel member super chat. If you are a member of the channel, that's that subscribe plus button below. For those of you who aren't, you get a free super chat on whatever channel you are a member of once a month. Use it. Don't care what channel it is. If you're a channel member of Dr. Taylor Marshall's channel, use it when you talk to him, when he does a live stream. It gives you the opportunity to have your questions jump out here. Daria says Francis's docs to be read by Cardinals before consistory. Yes, that was part of the preparation for the consistory. Was the reading of his documents, as if to remind people that they were not going to abandon the way Francis said things. Now, that nun is from Germany, but that's not the only news we have out of Germany, unfortunately, because when it rains, it pours. Headline from Gloria TV's en.news service. This is translated using a Chrome extension. The church's family model is discriminatory, writes a German James Martin type Jesuit. Redundancy, though, personally, I think it's more noteworthy when a Jesuit is not of the James Martin inclination. But he's rejecting the traditional family structure. Jesuits. It's always Jesuits, isn't it? The normative glorification of the traditional family as practiced by the Catholic Church leads to discrimination against believers who do not live in this way, German Jesuit Klaus Mertes told Zeit.de on Christmas Day. What a day to attack the family. The church, according to him, must essentially preach in a way that is in alignment with the way people who claim to be believers live, not calling people to conversion. No, it's believers who will call through their lives the church to conversion. Father Mertes became known in 2010 as a proponent of the public handling of clerical James Martin type McCarrick cases involving male victims in church institutions in Germany. In the interview, Father Mertes warned that the Catholic Church must be careful how the model of the traditional family, which it explicitly favors, could be politically instrumentalized. The Catholic Church must be careful that the classic image of the family, which it openly promotes, is not politically misused, he says. This happens again and again, and that is a problem. And what he's referring here obliquely to is in Germany, the German bishops have been very much unified with Protestant groups in condemning a political party called the AfD, the Alternative for Germany. Then when you look at their policy proposals, they're like moderate Republicans in the United States. But in Germany, that's far right. That tells you how far off the deep end German politics have gone. They were apoplectic at the fact that suddenly it looks like that group is going to maybe capture parliament at some point if they can get a fair shake in their processes. And I say if they can get a fair shake because there have been some weird things that have happened to them every time they're up to bat. But they're gaining popularity, large amount of popularity. And the German bishops are freaking out about this. That party pretty much came as close as you can in a parliamentary election in the last contest to winning the outcome. And the German bishops and the German church in general they chime in about politics in a way that would make Americans blush. Cardinal Supich is fairly restrained in his endorsement of Democrats by comparison to how the church in Germany does things. Now, if you're not aware, this priest is an activist for that sin that James Martin has such a weird interest in for a priest. He has written numerous articles over the past decade where he criticizes normal attitudes about that sin within the church. He called on Catholics to fight for the rights of those with those inclinations. He argues that the church's prevailing stance on that sin is discriminatory and pastorally harmful. It's the church in Germany. You're not going to see much action taken from Rome against them. That'd be an easy way to take care of this problem, actually. The next time the bishops of Germany have their ad limina visit with the Pope, that's where the Conference of Bishops gets to meet, and each bishop gets a one-on-one with the Pope. Happens every year or every other year. The next time that happens, the Pope can arrange to meet with each of the bishops one-on-one. And with each and every one of them, except for the handful who have stood against the German synodal way, that's the attempt to secularize, Protestantize the Catholic Church in Germany, turn it into like a liberal Protestant organization, he can reduce each and every one of them to the lay state in their one-on-one meetings, and then have the Swiss Guard sequester the cardinal in question, or the bishop in question, and then have a bunch of new German priests ready to be elevated to the office of bishop there, to fill in the blanks as needed. He could put Bishop Schneider, who is German, speaks German, might be in Kazakhstan, but he speaks German. His family had roots in Germany. He could put him in charge of the highest profile diocese there. Now, I don't think he's going to, but that'd be one way to take care of the problem. Because clearly there's rot, severe rot in the church in Germany, as my constant coverage of this problem shows you. But he reconfirmed the nun, who is the exemplification of this problem. I'm very curious what you think about this, so let me know what you think about this in the comments. And remember to like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Share this on social media. That helps too. Pray for everybody we spoke about today. The church in Germany is a hot mess. It is a hot mess, and it needs practically divine intervention to actually be, once again, unequivocally the Catholic Church instead of whatever James Martin fairy tale stuff they've gone off the deep end into. But please pray for everybody spoken about negatively today. And as always, again, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.